Today, I'm going to be talking about nurses, who they were, what they did, what challenges they faced. And to some extent, I'm going to look at Civil War nurses through the experience of one particular woman, Mary Finney Vaughn Allhausen, though we won't do just Mary's experience. Before I start, I do want to offer one caveat, because my book dealt with Civil War nursing, organizing it around a particular hospital, which was Mansion House Hospital in Alexandria, Virginia. That means I'm really focusing on women who nursed for the Union. The Confederate experience was different in some really fascinating and important ways, and if people have questions about that and we have time, I'll try to answer that at the end. So, the first thing you need to know about nursing in the Civil War was that nursing as a skilled profession barely existed in the mid-19th century. And it certainly didn't exist in the United States, which was pretty much a medical backwater in 1861. For the most part, nursing for pay, and particularly nursing in a hospital, wasn't something that respectable women did. As a practical matter, most women had some experience of nursing at a domestic level, taking care of a sick family member, a sick neighbor. But nursing at that level really wasn't about providing medical care. It was about providing comfort. It meant making sure a patient was clean, that they had liquids, that they were fed, and it meant being there, watching in case something was needed. Beyond that domestic shared experience of nursing, there were a few women who worked as private nurses in well-to-do families. They tended to be older. Basically, they were temporary domestic servants who provided the same services that a family member would provide in a less wealthy home. Then there was an enormous step down the social scale to the women who nursed in hospitals. And that was partly due to the nature of the hospitals themselves. There weren't very many of them. They only existed in the largest cities, and they were charity institutions. Now, we'd all like to think that a charity hospital would have been a clean, well-run, pleasant place, but in fact, they were dirty, smelly, dangerous places that people rightly regarded as death traps. Even if you lived in a big city that had a general hospital, if it was at all possible, female family members still took care of ailing relatives at home. Only the poorest and most desperate people went to a hospital when they were sick. Not surprisingly, that means that the women who were willing to work as nurses in those hospitals were basically as desperate as the people they took care of. For example, it was really a job for women who just had few options left. At Bellevue Hospital in New York, for instance, most of the nurses were what they called 10-day women. These were women who had been arrested for drunkenness or disorderly conduct and were sentenced to 10 days in the workhouse. When they sobered up, they were given an option. That sentence could be paroled in exchange for working as a nurse in the wards at Bellevue for a month. Now, that tells you something about the conditions in the workhouse, that a month of work sounded better than 10 days in the workhouse. But it also tells you these women were not angels of mercy. I done that right? Yes. So public nursing advocate Florence Nightingale summed up the public perception of hospital nurses when she described them as women who were too old, too weak, too drunken, too dirty, too stolid, or too bad to do anything else. Nice girls didn't nurse. Now, that perception of nursing began to change just a few days before the Civil War. Not a few days, sorry, a few years before the Civil War. And that was thanks largely to Florence Nightingale herself. Her work in the Crimean War in 1854 caught the public imagination. You know, she was the lady with the lamp, and she threw open windows, she scrubbed dirty floors and dirtier soldiers, she bullied Army doctors into cooperating, and she saved lives. When her book, Notes for Nursing, was published a few years later, it was a bestseller. And that was true in the United States as well as in Great Britain. Hundreds, if not thousands, of American women read her book and were inspired by her vision that nursing could be a vocation. So when the Civil War began and there was a need for nursing, there were women who were eager to follow her example, even though there wasn't really a means in place that would allow them to do that. As I suspect many of you know, in April 1861, after the surrender of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 militia volunteers to help put down what he described as a state of insurrection. You know, he got an overwhelming response. But in addition to the tens of thousands of men who flooded into recruiting offices, he also got volunteers from a source he never expected, women who wanted to serve. Now, the first woman to volunteer was Dorothea Dix. At the time, Dix was 59 years old, and she'd spent the prior 20 years fighting to improve the treatment of prisoners, paupers, and the mentally ill. She was visiting with friends in Trenton, New Jersey, when she got the word that the war had started. She immediately packed up, got on a train, and headed toward Washington. It was kind of a wild ride. The trains were packed with newly mobilized troops. There were patriotic crowds greeting them at every station. And the other thing that greeted them at every station were rumors that Southern sympathizers were trying to stop trains from getting to D.C. Those rumors turned out to be pretty good. Dix actually caught the last train out of Philadelphia before the bridge over the river was destroyed. When she arrived at Washington on the night of April 19th, those Southern efforts meant that the city was on high alert. Pickets were guarding public buildings. There were soldiers billeted at the White House in case the Confederates attacked before morning. And a less determined woman might have said, I think I'm just gonna check into a hotel. Dix went straight to the White House. Now, if any other woman had shown up at the White House that night unannounced, she probably would have been turned away. But Dix had a national reputation as a humanitarian, a crusader, a successful lobbyist, and as a woman who got things done. She was used to working with powerful politicians. Some of the men she'd already worked with were there that night. They were used to working with her. So even with the threat that the Confederates were practically at the door, she was given a warm welcome, and she was given a fair hearing for what was really a revolutionary proposal. Dix volunteered her services to create a corps of female Army nurses to care for wounded soldiers. 4 days later, Secretary of War Simon Cameron accepted that proposal. In June, she was appointed the superintendent of women nurses for the Union Army, which was the first federal executive position to be held by a woman. Dix's proposal required a fundamental change in the way the Army thought about and handled nursing. Remember, not a skilled profession, something respectable women don't do. So prior to the Civil War, when the Army needed nurses, they pressed into service convalescent soldiers who were not well enough to go back to their active duties, but were too well to take up a bed. And left to its own devices, the Army would have done nothing to change that arrangement. And in fact, convalescent soldiers worked alongside female nurses throughout the course of the war. What Dix envisioned was a group of women modeled on the women who served with Florence Nightingale. And she had a very clear idea of what they should look like. And it's only fair to say that her standards really reflected her personal prejudices as well as the realities of what was required in the battlefield. She needed 2 letters of reference that testified to an applicant's morality, integrity, seriousness, and capacity to care for the sick. She didn't ask about experience or training because she assumed that anyone that she wanted wouldn't have either. She only accepted women between the ages of 30 and 50. Neatness, order, sobriety, particularly sobriety, and industry were required characteristics. Basically, she wanted women who were matronly, but were still strong enough to turn a full-grown man in his bed. And it turned out to be surprisingly easy to find them. Thousands of women volunteered. The largest number of volunteers came right after the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, but women continued to volunteer their services well into 1864. By some estimates, more than 20,000 women worked as nurses on the Union side over the course of the war. And that's not including women who did this on an ad hoc, uncompensated, almost anonymous basis. You know, the women who came a couple of afternoons to work in a hospital or who turned out to nurse people on the battlefield the way they did here at Gettysburg. So despite Dix's sort of cookie cutter image of what she wanted nurses to look like, in fact, the nurses were as diverse as the nation itself. There were teenaged girls, middle-aged widows, grandmothers. There were society belles, farm wives, factory girls, teachers, nuns, reformers, free African Americans and escaped slaves, new immigrants, and Mayflower descendants. Some of them were inspired by Nightingale's Notes for Nursing. Some came to nursing from religious conviction. The women who nursed for the United States Christian Commission, for instance, were as concerned with saving soldiers' souls as with caring for wounded bodies. Some joined because they had a real financial need caused by a husband's absence in the war. But many of them, maybe even most of them, volunteered as a result of that same desire for patriotic action that yet led so many young men to enlist in the first rush of enthusiasm. Louise May Alcott, for instance, who was not yet the well-known author of Little Women, was eager to have a part in the war from the very beginning. Soon after the fall of Fort Sumter, she wrote in her diary, "I long to be a man, but as I can't fight, I will content myself with working for those who can." Which brings me to Mary Finney Vaughn Allhausen, whose story is in some ways typical of the women who joined Dorothea Dix's nursing corps. Anyone who's seen the television series Mercy Street is already familiar with the young and lovely Mary Finney, who's one of the primary characters in the show. Well, let me introduce you to the real-life, historical Mary Finney Vaughn Allhausen. Mary Finney was born in Lexington, Massachusetts in 1818. She lived and worked on the family farm until she was 31. Then her father died, and she and her unmarried sisters needed to find ways to support themselves. Mary didn't take any of the usual paths available to an unmarried woman at the time. Instead, she studied textile design at Boston's newly founded School of Design for Women. It's one of several schools of this type that sprang up in northern industrial cities in the mid-19th century. By all accounts, she was actually a very talented designer, and she soon found work in New England's booming textile mills. And at that point, she probably assumed she would never marry. Then she met the Baron von Allhausen. Now, in spite of being a baron, possibly even, he was not the usual baron. He was a trained chemist, and he was also a radical political reformer. He came to the United States after the revolutions of 1848 that shook Europe, and he found work as a dye chemist in the same New Hampshire textile plant where Mary Finney worked. They married in 1858 when Mary was 40. By all accounts, they were very happy, but he died 2 years later. After Gustav's death, she moved to Illinois, where she helped her younger brother farm a homestead on the prairie. And if you read her memoirs, her experience looks very familiar. It's a lot like Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie, because most of their neighbors were poor Southerners who had moved west in search of land. And they disagreed with the Finneys in very fundamental ways about the political situation, particularly about slavery. And from Mary's perspective, it was almost a relief when war finally came and she could do something. She says she was inspired to volunteer by what she called that terrible affair at Bull Run. At that point, she'd been a widow for a little less than a year, and reading her memoir, I think it's possible that she was also eager to get off the prairie and to find some hard, all-encompassing work to distract her from her grief. Like women all over the North, she wrote letters to anyone she knew who might be able to get her a position in the new Army Nursing Corps. And then, like women all over the North who wrote those letters, she waited and waited and waited. And after a year, she decided she just wasn't gonna wait anymore. So she packed up, she took the train back to Massachusetts, and she found Dorothea Dix. Now, except for that biographical accident of becoming a baroness, Mary was exactly the type of woman that Dix wanted for the new Army Nursing Corps. She was an educated, unmarried, middle-aged, middle-class woman, not glamorous or conventionally pretty, though I actually think she's kind of handsome. She has a taste for reform, history of hard work. In August 1862, more than a year after she first tried to become a nurse, Vaughn Allhausen got her first assignment as a nurse at Mansion House Hospital in Alexandria, Virginia. There we go. The path was typical of women who joined Dix's nursing corps, but that wasn't the only path to nursing. Dix was responsible for appointing more women than any other person involved with nursing in the war. But in fact, the Dix nurses were just the largest piece in a crazy quilt of nurses drawn from many different sources with many different relationships to the Army. For instance, the United States Sanitary Commission appointed volunteer nurses. They had a semi-official relationship with the Army. Their nurses worked first on the transport hospital ships that the commission ran on a contract basis during the Peninsular Campaign, and then later on in special sanitary commission hospitals. And by and large, this group of women was drawn from a slightly different social strata than the Dix nurses. There was a solid core of them that were New York socialites who sort of took off the ruffles, took off the hoops, rolled up their sleeves, and did some really amazing work. So one step further away from being official were women who were commissioned as nurses to serve in the same units as their husbands. And this was an informal process that was in no way sanctioned by the Army itself, and really could only happen because local militias were in fact local, and local commanders pretty much chose what they wanted to do. Two of my favorites in this category are Estelle Johnson and her sister. According to Johnson, when her husband and brother-in-law enlisted, she and her sister went to the recruiting officer and said they wanted to go too. And she says they really didn't expect anything would come of it, so they were really surprised when a week later
he came back and said, you know, the colonel said nobody's called for nurses, but I think I want you to come. So a month later, they were formally sworn in to the 4th Vermont Regiment, Company J, in the presence of the regiment's colonel, the major, and the governor of Vermont. And they remained with that regiment until their husbands were discharged. Even further away from being official were women who simply showed up, whether at the battlefield or attaching themselves to a regiment and just did what needed to be done. The most well-known of these was Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, but she was by no means the only one. Cornelia Hancock, for instance, who was a young Quaker who was determined to serve. Her brother-in-law was a Philadelphia doctor, and he arranged for her to come here to Gettysburg with a group of women who had already been accepted as volunteer nurses. They were on the train platform in Philadelphia when Dix made one of her infamous, unannounced lightning visits to inspect her new nurses. She saw Hancock, and she immediately said, no. Youth, rosy cheeks, no. So while the other women are arguing with Dix on Hancock's behalf, Hancock just got on the train and came to Gettysburg. And when she got here, she found the need was so great that no one cared how young she was or what she looked like. No matter what path women took to nursing, whether they were official nurses or unofficial volunteers, whether they worked in a hospital or on the battlefield, they all faced similar challenges. And the first one was that often their families didn't want them to come. For every woman who volunteered as a nurse, there was another one who was held back by objections of her family or her friends, or even just the weight of society's expectations about what a lady did and did not do. You know, it was commonly believed that working in a hospital would coarsen even the most refined lady. And one surgeon summed that up when Harriet Dada, who had been a missionary in the West and came back east to volunteer, she showed up at his hospital and he told her, a lady ceases to be a lady when she becomes a nurse. Yep. Families worried that their daughters' reputations would be ruined by being in the well-known moral laxity of hospitals, or that they would have to fight off sexual advances from their badly wounded, very ill patients. Ironically, there were some doctors who were worried that their patients would have to fight off sexual advances from man-hungry nurses. One doctor even wrote to Surgeon General William Hammond and beseeched him, and it's his verb, beseeched him, to issue an order prohibiting nurses from throwing themselves into the arms of sick and wounded soldiers and lasciviously exciting their animal passions. You can tell from the capital letters how strongly he felt about this, and we can only assume that he met nurses who had in fact ceased to be ladies. So, a woman overcomes her family's objections or decides to ignore them, does almost the unthinkable and gets on a train by herself to travel to her first assignment. And when she gets there, she finds out the Army doesn't want her. Most of the doctors in the Army's medical bureau opposed the use of female nurses in military hospitals. They argued that women didn't have the upper body strength to do the job. They complained that they didn't have the training to do the job, unlike the convalescent soldiers who were pressed into service on an ad hoc basis. They expressed concerns about what they described as the inevitable affront to female modesty in the rough atmosphere in the hospital, and then made vague allusions to catheters and bedpans. And when all other arguments failed, they fell back on that old classic, the Army's never used women as nurses before, and we see no reason to change our minds now. There was actually a real problem for the military with the use of these volunteer female nurses. And that was that they were an anomaly in the hierarchy of the military hospital. Nursing had a clearly defined place in the hospital. Convalescent soldiers had a very clearly defined place in military hierarchy. But the volunteer female nurses were there as civilians and volunteers, and their place in that hierarchy was a lot less clear. And a lot of the women felt that that meant that they didn't actually have to follow the hospital's rules. And it was especially true for nurses who were not being paid for their work. Dix's nurses did actually receive a small salary. One of my favorite examples of this is the case of Mary Newcomb. Mary stayed in the ward late one night to take care of one of her patients. And the wardmaster, to whom she at least nominally reported, came in to tell her that she was in violation of the chief surgeon's rule that all lights had to be out at 9:30. And Newcomb exploded. "You tell that surgeon, whoever he is, I will burn as many lights as I please. I'm no hired nurse. I volunteered my services free. And there shall be no red tape, but I shall break it when humanity demands it." Now, even if that's gee, I wish I'd said that she wrote in her letter later, it makes the attitude very clear. And this built-in institutional conflict meant that meeting a hostile doctor was almost a rite of passage for nurses when they arrived at new hospitals. Georgeanna Wolsey, who nursed for the Sanitary Commission, wrote later about the early days of the war, and she described their shared experience this way. "No one knows who did not watch the thing from the beginning, how much opposition, how much ill will, how much unfeeling want of thought these women nurses endured. Hardly a surgeon whom I can think of received or treated them with even common courtesy. Government had decided that women should be employed, and the army surgeons, unable therefore to close the hospitals against them, determined to make their lives so unbearable that they should be forced in self-defense to leave. It seemed a matter of cool calculation." Mary Vaughn Allhausen certainly experienced one of those acts of cool calculation. The chief surgeon at Mansion House Hospital did not want one of Dorothea Dix's nurses in his hospital. And if doctors were hostile to female nurses in general, they were even more hostile to Dix nurses because Dragon Dix, as they called her, was prone to meddle. So Dr. Summers was determined to force von Allhausen out, and he used what was a very common technique. He just refused to give her a bed. Now, that worked for some women. It didn't work for von Allhausen. She just slept in the ward on the floor next to her patients for several weeks, and then when a room opened up, she just moved herself in. Family objections, military objections, hostile doctors were in some ways small problems. The biggest problems nurses faced were the ones presented by the work itself. On von Allhausen's first night at Mansion House Hospital, the wounded from the Battle of Cedar Mountain poured through the door. The battle had been a military defeat, and it was a medical debacle. Patients lay in the August sun for several days before they were evacuated. When they arrived at the hospital, they were exhausted, ragged, dehydrated, mud-caked, bloody. The bandages hadn't been changed since they'd been dressed in the field, and those were the lucky men because some men's wounds weren't dressed at all because the field surgeons ran out of supplies. Von Allhausen was literally standing in the hospital office waiting to meet the surgeon for the first time when the patients began to arrive. An orderly showed her into the surgical ward. People told her what to do. No one told her how to do it. Now, she had actually had a fair amount of experience at domestic nursing, more than was common for the time, but it wasn't adequate preparation for dealing with the effects of cannon shell, bayonets, mini balls. She was seeing carnage on a scale that she couldn't have imagined. And she was also faced with her own ignorance. In her letter home, she wrote that she just wanted to throw herself down on the floor and give up. It was a hopeless task. How could she do anything that would help? But she was a tough broad, and she eventually pulled herself together and decided that what she needed to do was learn. So for those first few days, she followed the doctors, she watched, she made men comfortable as best she could, and as soon as there was a quiet moment in the hospital, several days later, she got someone to teach her how to dress a bandage a wound. It was really the first step. And by the end of the war, the doctors she worked with considered her indispensable. She actually got a letter of commendation from several of the doctors who got together. That experience wasn't unusual. When Cornelia Hancock got here, she said no one paid her or her companions any attention at all. And since no one gave them orders or could answer any questions, they just split up and decided to each go find something they could do to be useful. At that point, the people of Gettysburg had already begun to organize and were taking care of the wounded. And Hancock just came to the conclusion that she really wasn't experienced enough to help with the actual nursing, but what she could do was feed the men. So she appropriated a loaf of bread and a jar of jam from a supply wagon, found a shingle that she could use as a tray, and since she didn't have a knife or anything else, she broke it up by hand into bite-sized pieces and then took a stick and spread jam on the pieces of bread and then took her shingle from man to man. When the bread was gone, went back to the supply wagon and got some cans of condensed milk and did the same thing. Many of the nurses, without even the most basic introduction to the work they were there to do, having nursed a relative through measles or helped splint someone's broken leg was all they'd done, and then they were just plunged into a chaos of crowded hospitals, a stream of broken bodies, brains oozing from head wounds and jaws that were half shot off and gut wounds and perforated lungs and what had to just seem like floods of diarrhea. And when the wounded arrived, 40 or 500 or 1,000 at a time, no one was able to take an inexperienced nurse aside and show her what to do. It was on-the-job training of the most chaotic variety. Ultimately, the most obvious skill that nurses needed to learn, and the one they took the most pride in, was how to dress and bandage a wound. But even just changing a bandage on a wound could mean more than taking off a soiled bandage and putting on a clean one, depending on the nature of the wound. And we get a really vivid description of that from a woman named Elvira Powers, who was a 30-year-old school teacher who nursed at Jefferson General Hospital in Indiana. Almost the first task she was given was to help change. She was asked to hold a soldier's arm while a more senior nurse changed his bandage. The wound had previously been packed with oakum, which is a fibrous material that you make by taking apart a tarred rope. And a lot of doctors at the time preferred it for dressing a wound to cotton lint because it was more absorbent, and also because they thought the tar would help inhibit the decay in the wound. So this wound had already been packed with oakum, and now it was time to take it out. So Powers was asked to support the soldier's arm by the elbow. And it was red and it was swollen, probably very tender to the touch. The other nurse had a pair of pincers, and she was picking out the pus-soaked oakum, which was sticking to the wound. And when she got that clean, she had to take off the bits of burned flesh from around the raw flesh of the wound. And in her letter, Powers says she was doing okay until the man's arm began to shake in her hand, and he began to cry out for mercy. And at that point, she was afraid they might have another patient if she stayed in the tent. So she got another nurse to take his arm. She ran for the door, And after a few moments in the fresh air, when she was pretty sure she wasn't going to faint, she came back in and went back to work. And she ended her letter this way: necessary to imbibe a little more of the heroic before I can be of much help during an operation. All laugh at me, even the patient. But it isn't expected that a school ma'am can be transformed into a dissecting surgeon in a minute. Guess it'll take about a fortnight. Bandaging wounds, splinting broken bones, assisting at amputations, those were the most dramatic parts of the nurse's job. But at least one nurse claimed that the real work of nursing came when the official day was over. Many nurses spent evenings in the ward where they read to soldiers, soothed them to sleep, listened to their stories. One of the most important things they did was help soldiers write letters home. In fact, at one point, Vaughn Allhausen was writing so many letters that she claimed that if she'd known that was going to be part of the job, she would never have volunteered. Some patients had wounds that didn't allow them to hold a pen. Some were too weak to sit up. Some were illiterate. Most of them had something they needed to say. And with nurses' help, they wrote home to their parents, their pastors, old friends, brothers, sisters, sweethearts. In some cases, they dictated a letter and then managed to sign it themselves in their own hand. In some cases, they struggled to find the words and left nurses to fill in the blanks. They asked for warm socks. They asked for apples. They begged family members to come visit. All too often, they wrote to say goodbye. Nursing wasn't a job for everyone. Hundreds of the women lasted little more than a month. Some of them simply found they didn't have the temperament or the stomach to do the job. They tried, they went home. I like to think they went right back to the Ladies' Aid Society and picked up doing that very important work. Others succumbed to the same diseases as the men under their care. Louise May Alcott, for instance, worked at Union House Hospital for less than 40 days before she came down with typhoid pneumonia. She was so ill that her father had to come get her to take her home, and her health never recovered. She was one of the lucky ones. Her supervisor died of the same disease. The ones who lasted, though, they were transformed by their experience. Nurses who survived the first few months learned to stand up for themselves and for their patients. Unlike doctors, they worked in a very intimate relationship. They got to know their patients as individuals, and consequently, they began to see themselves as advocates. And as advocates, they quarreled with doctors and hospital stewards about the diet. They fought to maintain control of the luxury boxes. Sometimes they fought to keep a patient alive after a doctor decided that it was too late. And eventually, some of them reached the conclusion that they could run the hospital better than the men who were in charge. This is Kathryn Prescott Wormley, who served on the hospital transport ships and later as the matron for a hospital for convalescent soldiers. And she summed up the feeling of many women who were frustrated by the failures of the system when she said, "I should like to have charge of a hospital now. I could make it march if only I had some of the administrative power." The war was a pivotal experience for many of the women who served as nurses, whether for 3 weeks or 3 years. It was their first time away from home and family for the most part, their first time at stepping outside the bounds of what society expected from them. They learned new skills. They also got new confidence. Over and over in their letters and in their memoirs, they expressed deep satisfaction with the work and the way of life, even at the same time that they were just complaining bitterly about a particular detail. Wormley, again, claimed to speak for Army nurses as a whole when she said, "We all know in our hearts that it is thorough enjoyment to be here. It is life, in short. and we wouldn't be anywhere else for anything in the world. Emily Parsons, who was a nurse for 2 years, even though she was lame, blind in one eye, and partially deaf, took that sentiment one step further and said, "I should like to live so all the rest of my life." She didn't, of course. Parsons, like most of the women, went home. Nursing was a temporary part of their lives, just like being a soldier was a temporary part of the lives of most of the men who served. They stepped back into their old roles as daughters, wives, seamstresses, school teachers, and reformers. And it's in some way that role of reformers after the war that's the most important part of the story. Another way in which the Civil War changed everything. For many years, I've been fascinated by the women who disguised themselves as men and enrolled to fight. But as I got deeper into the stories of the women who served as nurses, I came to realize that they played a far more important role in what happened to society after the war than those really very fascinating women who fought. Many of them used their newfound experience at organizing and sort of elbowing their way through a bureaucracy to help change their world. Cornelia Hancock, for instance, started a school for the children of former slaves in South Carolina. And that was a more dangerous job than you might think. At one point, someone who objected to the idea of educating black children shot her schoolhouse up with 50 rounds. Other women involved themselves in building hospitals for women and children, reforming prisons and asylums, providing vocational training for girls. They formed relief funds for war widows and orphans and programs for settling unemployed veterans on farmland in the West. Some became active in the labor movement, the women's rights movement, the temperance movement. A few used their experience as a springboard to national leadership roles where they founded groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the American Red Cross. If you look at an American reform movement in the 30 to 40 years after 1865, the odds are good that you're going to find a Civil War nurse or two in the middle, and often in charge. The one thing very few of them did was continue to work as a nurse. But if they didn't work as nurses after the war, their collective experience in the war convinced Americans that nursing was not only a respectable job for a woman, but that it should be a skilled profession. In 1868, the American Medical Association recommended that general hospitals open schools to train nurses. It was a two-edged response to the success of the women who nursed in the Civil War. On the one hand, they admitted that having skilled nurses in a hospital was a good thing, but they also made it really clear that they wanted to avoid another flood of untrained, uncontrollable volunteer nurses in a future war. By 1880, there were 15 nursing schools in the United States. By 1900, there were 432. And I think this change can best be illustrated by an anecdote from 1903, almost 40 years after the end of the war. In June of that year, the American Nurses Association met for its 6th annual convention. And at one point in the meeting, the nurses' president announced that there was another organization of nurses meeting in the same building, women who had served as nurses in the Civil War. And she suggested that it would be appropriate if the convention pay tribute to those nurses in some way. And a woman in the crowd immediately had an idea and suggested that they invite Civil War nurses to attend the afternoon session of their meeting. Now, personally, I think this was a setup because the next speaker was Mary Livermore, a Civil War nurse who went on to become a national leader of the women's suffrage movement. Livermore rose to welcoming applause, and she began her address with a tribute from the older nurses to the new. A congregation of trained women nurses, something that in my earlier days I never expected to see, that I always thought of and that I always thought was a desirable thing to accomplish. She went on to say what many of the younger women in the room were no doubt thinking. The women you've just invited to meet with you are wrecks only, simply driftwood left from the Civil War. But, she reminded her listeners, they had a great work to do without any of the advantages that you would have if you were in their place today. Their legacy stood before her. Trained nurses who could be called to duty in the case of another war. Nurses, she said, who know what to do and how to do it, who have learned to obey and have learned when they must depart from instructions. From her perspective, the nurses before her represented the best thing that had happened to the status of women in society in the prior 50 years, a direct result of the women who volunteered to nurse in the Civil War. Thank you. Yep. I can take some questions. And
what effect did women have upon the unbelievable, filthy conditions of Civil War hospitals?
Actually, they did a lot. One of the things they did most was clean, and in fact, there was a doctor on the transport ships who basically said the best things that could happen for sanitation were female nurses and whitewash. In the back? No, we'll get this one and then you.
You didn't mention anything about religious organizations either leading the way with nursing or following the way.
There was certainly the United States Christian Commission, which was formed a little bit later than the United States Sanitary Commission and was definitely a religious organization involved. There were also several hundred nuns
Yeah.
who served, and in fact, a lot of the doctors, if they had a choice, preferred the nuns to the volunteers because they were much more inclined to take orders. And we had another question over here.
Any idea as to the mortality rate?
I really don't, but there was certainly a fair number who died, and often the women nurses were taken harder than the men that they nursed because they were already worn down from the nursing. A well-known. Yeah. I'll tell you what, since you've already had one, why don't we go here first?
On a day-to-day basis, how were they housed and fed? And if they were volunteers, I guess they came, they went, and there was never any pay or compensation.
Well, the ones who were part of Dix's Corps received $12 a month plus the same rations that a soldier would get. And they often had to fight for those. That was one of the ways in which hostile stewards and doctors attempted to control them, which by making it difficult to get their rations. Women who just volunteered, well, in the Sanitary Commission, again, provided rations, and they would live in the hospitals or on the ships. Women who just showed up kind of did the best they could. Clara Barton obviously was pretty well stocked. She had several warehouses full of stuff that she brought to the field. That's it. I'm sorry, that's it. If you want to grab me, I'll try and answer it. Thank you all very much.